I accidentally started a business when I was just 17 years old. And let me tell you, there is a lot that I can unpack from that experience. So, welcome to today's episode, where I'm going to be unpacking not just my experience of being a young entrepreneur, but more specifically, what I feel were some of the positives about that, what I feel helped me in my business journey, but also some of the things that presented as challenges and things that I feel really hindered me being such a young person while starting a business. Now, I've talked a fair bit on this podcast about my business journey, but it's always kind of been through the lens of the facts, right? Like, I quit school at 16, I got offered this job, I did it for a year, then I took a job as a social media manager freelance, then it snowballed from there, then I burnt out, then I rebuilt. Like, I've told my story a few times, but I've never really sat down to kind of unpick specifically the kind of young entrepreneur side of that story and what I feel that experience was like. It actually wasn't until a few weeks ago when I was hosting one of my business retreats, and one of the attendees was said to me, well, why don't you talk more about like being such a young entrepreneur? Like, why do you not talk more about what that was like? You know, there'll be a lot of people that are at school or at that earlier stage thinking about going into entrepreneurship, especially these days. And it kind of surprised me that they said that, but then I was like, well, that makes sense as a question. But to me, you know, I don't feel like a young entrepreneur anymore. I'm now 26, which I appreciate is still a young age, but I'm not so much that like shockingly young business owner that I used to be, age 17. And B, I guess it's that thing that we all have with our own story where I'm like, I don't know anything different. Like, to me, being a young entrepreneur wasn't the worst thing ever. It also wasn't the best thing ever. I think there's quite balanced pros and cons, much like I imagine there is to starting a business at any age or any life stage. And so I can't necessarily look through the lens of like, oh, it was better or it was worse. I can just look through the lens of like, well, this was my story and this was my experience, and here's what maybe we can, you know, collectively learn from that. So I thought in this episode I could maybe dive into that in a little bit more detail. And I've kind of sat down prior to recording this and really reflected on, I guess, a bit of a pros and cons list of like being a young entrepreneur. What do I feel helped me to grow because I was young? And then what do I feel hindered me? What are the kind of cons, I guess, of starting a business so young? Now, before I dive into kind of those key points that I want to share today, first of all, I want to say something very exciting, which is that my signature core program on it is going to be opening its doors in a couple of weeks' time. You might have heard me talk more about On It over the last few months. I did a big launch review about it in January, which a lot of you listened to, but it is my ongoing group program, which really helps business owners to work on their business, not just in it. You can almost think of it like a kind of PT, but for your business growth. So I don't tell you what to do, but I hold space every single month for you to come, step back, do big picture work, cast vision, set goals, track your progress, and then stay accountable as you take action. I don't believe business owners need to be told what to do or given a blueprint. I think we just need a bit of space and support and structure to help us cast our vision and then obviously stay accountable to that. The doors have been shut for the whole of Q1, but they're about to open again in March for people to join for the whole rest of the year. So it's a 9-month commitment, and I'll share more closer to the date, but let me just tell you, there's some great feedback already coming through from the community. It's a genuinely brilliant program. And so if you are thinking about joining, maybe you had FOMO because you weren't in that first round, now is your time. If you head to the show notes, wherever you're tuning into this episode, you will see a link to join the waitlist. That will mean that you are first in line for when doors open. They're not going to be open for long, so I'm just giving you this reminder now so you don't miss out, because the doors will not open again until the middle of this year. So that's the main thing I wanted to tell you just before I dive in. And the second thing I wanted to talk about before I dive in is, I guess, just a little bit of context as to my origin story, if we want to call it that. That sounds very fancy, doesn't it? As a business owner. I have done episodes before kind of sharing the facts, so I'll link one of those in the show notes if you really want to dive into the detail. But to give you the kind of top level summary so the rest of this episode makes more sense to you, I quit school early when I was 16 years old. In the UK, that means leaving school partway between your A-levels. So I had got a few months, I want to say maybe like 6 months into my AS levels. Just wasn't going well for me. Like, intellectually, I was kind of good at school, but I just didn't enjoy it. The social side of it wasn't really for me. I was starting to find it a bit frustrating, just like rinsing and repeating this knowledge, you know, for years and years and years. I was kind of like, I want to go do something real and I want to get stuck into something. So it was just before actually I sat my exams for my AS levels that I quit school, and I quit school for a full-time job doing events management, which stemmed from me being an elf in a garden centre. True story. One of the only real jobs I've ever had was as an elf. It was great, taught me a lot. I still did my exams, so I've got half an A-level if anyone wants to employ me. But I did that for almost a year before I was then offered a freelance job as a social media manager. I won't bore you with all the details in this episode of how and why that came to be, but it was a combination of a bumping into a random person at a hotel breakfast, probably slightly blagging my way into a role that I didn't have the expertise for, and also probably them thinking, she's young, she'll know social media. Not a correct assumption to make, by the way, but they offered me a freelance role. I didn't really know what freelance meant, but I said yes. That is what led me to kind of accidentally step into the world of being self-employed and starting a business. I didn't realize it at the time, but that was the beginning of a very long journey. It's now been almost 10 years since that point, and the last 10 years, they have by no means been a kind of straight upward line of growth, but the last 10 years have been incredible. I'm so glad that I started a business so young. Even if it was an accident, it's the best accident I have ever made. Like I said, in today's episode, I'm going to be really diving into those first couple of years of my experience, and particularly what I feel happened as a result of being such a young business owner, because I feel like I'm allowed to say that 17 is a young age to start a business, but I'm sure there's someone out there that's started a business when they were 12. Fun fact, I did actually have a business when I was I think I was 14. I made wooden signs. The company name was Alice's D Signs. Get it? Like designs, but signs. And I would make shabby chic furniture, and I'd make signs that said hope, faith, love, count your blessings. I would sell them to my mum's friends and on Facebook. So I guess I was always a little bit entrepreneurial from a young age, but the actual business that begun paying some bills was the one that I started age 17. So that is the experience that we're talking about today. So what I'm going to share is 2 things that I feel helped me in being a young entrepreneur, and 2 things that I feel hindered me as being a young entrepreneur. So we're going to keep it nice and balanced, and that genuinely is how I feel about the experience. I'm not overly relying on one of those points more than the other. I really do feel like it was a real mix of pros and cons, and looking back, I don't see it as the worst or the best experience. I see it A, just as my experience, and B, as one that I think, like many things in life, had very equal pros and cons to it. So without further ado, let's dive in. We're going to begin with the positive. The first thing that I feel really helped me as a young entrepreneur is that I was so naive, and partnered with that, I was so incredibly enthusiastic. Whenever anyone asks me, what was your past self like? Or if you saw that trend recently that was going for coffee with your past self. Anytime I think of past me, the word that pops into my head every single time is naive. If you were to word associate with me and you were one word that comes to mind when you think of your 17-year-old self, naive. And I say naive in a really positive way, because I think back when I was 17, or even back when I was 16 and I quit school in the first place, that's what led to me being able to start the business. I just see an intense level of optimistic naivety, where I was so excited by things. I really focused on what could go right instead of what could go wrong. I guess that's also helped by the fact that I didn't have much fear of what could go wrong, because I didn't have a mortgage to pay, or bills to pay, or family to support. I had the ability to be incredibly optimistic, because worst case scenario was still pretty cushy, because I lived at home. I was really naive, and I credit a huge amount of my growth in the early days to that. I had to be naive to quit school. That didn't make sense to quit school. I was doing well. I probably would have got quite good A-levels. I probably could have gotten to a good university. Even if I knew that university wasn't for me, which I'd always known, it didn't really make sense to leave before the end of my A-levels. I could have just waited it out. But that naivety was no, I think this thing could be better. And I see the same when I started my business. People would ask me, do you want to give this a go? Or do you want to talk about doing this project? And I do not believe in fake it till you make it, in the sense of lying or making things up. I was always very honest about where my abilities stopped, but I was also very honest with where my abilities stopped and my enthusiasm began. Because back in those days, I did not have the expertise. I did not have all the experience, but what I did have is the enthusiasm. So I knew that even if I didn't know something, I was kind of naive enough to believe that I could figure it out, and enthusiastic enough to actually put in the work to figure it out. So that naivety, I think, was incredibly powerful for me. And it's actually something I often think about in the day-to-day of my business now, is how do I keep that naive optimism. There's a lot more at stake now, not just in the sense of my business is far bigger. There's, a sense of reputation. There's people to make sure that the business supports. But of course, I've also got a life, right? I've now got a mortgage and a partner and other things that rely on the business going well. So I can't be, risky and naive to the level that I was back then. But I think there's something in that spirit that's so helpful when you run a business, because you've got to believe in things that seem a bit crazy. You've got to be a bit delusional. You've got to be more excited by what can go right versus what could go wrong, because otherwise, why would we take these risks and put in the work? So that naivety and I think kind of the energy that came with it was such a blessing. I actually call it now puppy energy. And I mean that in a really endearing way of like, when you're early on in a business, I just think you have this puppy energy. Like, I'm 10 years in now. I'm tired. I'm a bit fatigued. I'm a bit worn out. I see people that are right at the start of their business journeys and I feel a bit jealous sometimes of the energy they have. Like, not just like physically the energy, but just like the excitement and the enthusiasm. And I see that, and I see a lot of that in my first few years of business, partly I think just from being so fresh. Like, I had not worked a single job other than in this kind of elf Christmas role, which you could argue probably allowed me to be more enthusiastic than a regular corporate role would. So I just had all this energy out the gate. If you imagine like a racehorse when they're ready to go, right? They're stood in the gate, they're getting their energy up, they're getting excited. I felt like that was me like the whole way through secondary school. And so then when I went to be able to start this business, even if I didn't know it was a business at the time, I just had all this energy. Like, I was so excited. And I think in the early days, you've got to love it, because for so long a business doesn't give you back what you need and want. I wasn't making the money I needed to survive, but I was so excited. So that kept me going. This podcast again is a good example of that. In the early days, we didn't get many listeners, but I loved it so much, I kept going. So that enthusiasm, I think, helped me not just to get started, but to stay consistent, even when it felt sticky at times. And like I said, I think a lot about how now in my business, I can bring a sense of that still into the day-to-day, still have that naivety, still have that fresh energy, and really bring that optimism and enthusiasm to my business. So that is my first point of what I feel has helped me in being a young entrepreneur. That then moves me over into my second point, which is going to be my first hinder. So this is one of the things that I think really hindered me as a young business owner. And I think it's probably the stereotypical thing that comes to mind when you think about the challenges of being young, is not being taken seriously. Now, this is an interesting challenge, or kind of con, however you want to see it, because I actually only see this now in hindsight. At the time, I didn't really realize that maybe people weren't always taking me seriously. I probably, again, that naive optimism, just focused on the good stuff and everything else went over my head. So I'm glad for that. But now looking back, I can definitely see experiences in the early days of my business where I'm thinking, maybe if I were to go into that space now, maybe I'd be taken in a different way. Or even, to add the other kind of piece to the puzzle in, is I was also a young female entrepreneur. So I wasn't just young, but I was also a woman. And in a lot of the spaces that I was in when my business first begun, I was the youngest in the room, and a lot of the time also the only woman in the room. Actually, nowadays I work primarily with women and with a really diverse range of ages. But back when my business begun, I was working a lot with large charities and corporates. So in those spaces, it was even less diverse, especially in terms of age range. And I often would kind of be like the outlier in the room. Now, I think I learned how to kind of use that to my advantage and to kind of make that part of what made me memorable, and hope that that was something that kind of people were drawn to me for. But like I said, there's a few experiences where I think, I don't think that I was taken seriously, and I can only really see that now. In fact, one that comes to mind, which I feel like so many people have their own version of this story, which we could laugh at, but also it's really sad that this is the case. I was in a company, I must have been like 18 years old, and I was coming into a company to do a workshop with them around marketing. And the person that had kind of brought me in was an employee within the team. It wasn't the CEO. So when the CEO came into the room for me to start this workshop, for me to lead their whole team, they asked me to go and get them a coffee because they thought that I was the intern. They thought I was the person, the young person there that was just hired to be the help, and all for internships and, doing the job that needs to get done. But I wasn't there for that. I was there because I was leading the thing. I think, again, that probably naive optimism, I didn't even take that as a negative. I was like, yeah, no worries, I'll get you a coffee. Made them a coffee. I didn't drink coffee at the time, so I'm sure it was awful. And then hosted my workshop. And I do remember seeing the look on his face as I began the workshop, and he clocked kind of his misunderstanding and having that slight smug feeling of like, yeah, you misunderstood me, or kind of you underestimated me, I guess is what happened. But without turning this kind of, challenge into a positive, I would say, I think in the early days, I used this to fuel me. I was quite excited, kind of being the outlier, being the only young woman in the room. I quite liked proving people wrong. I quite enjoyed people underestimating me, because then it was actually quite easy to kind of be impressive in some way. So in hindsight, I do see moments where this kind of hindered me, and I'm sure there's so many experiences where I have no clue about it, but I probably was taken in a different way, or maybe not considered for something because of my age and because of being a young woman as well. But like I said, at the time, I don't think I really saw that, and actually I'm quite glad for that, because I don't think that would have been a helpful thing to be that aware of. I would definitely also then flip this on its head, and I think, it does make you memorable, especially in the early days, because I was working in marketing. What do people think of with marketing? They think of like future generations and young people, and there's that association, not saying it's correct, that young people are better at social media or better at marketing because they've grown up with it. And so in a way, I guess I could kind of use that age thing to my advantage, because it was that feeling of like, well, yeah, she's not got loads of experience, but she's young, and because she's young, therefore she must know all of these things. Don't think people have such a kind of black and white assumption now, but 10 years ago, things were very different. And yeah, I kind of could get away with not always being the most knowledgeable in the room, because ultimately with marketing, it's not about having the most knowledge, it's about having the most understanding of people and willingness to adapt and learn and all of those good things. So that, I'd say, is the second thing that I reflect on as a young entrepreneur, and kind of the first challenge is that it did feel at times like I was kind of fighting a bit of an uphill battle, I guess, and having to work a little bit harder to maybe be taken seriously or respected. That moves me on then to the next reflection point, which is, again, opposite end of the spectrum. One of the things that I feel really helped me as a young entrepreneur is the pure reality of being able to take very big risks, because they weren't big risks. Right? I've mentioned it already. When I fell into business age 17, I was living at home. I didn't have, therefore, big living expenses. My parents, by the way, were the parents that would charge you rent. That is a big debate in the Benham household as to whether that was, cruel that they did that. But we paid rent as kids, but, nowhere near the rent that I would have been paying if I were to have moved out and been paying for myself. I didn't have a mortgage. I didn't have big bills to pay. And let's be transparent as well. If worst came to worst, I didn't have to pay my parents that rent every month. They weren't going to kick me out. If I really, really, really needed the help, they would have supported me financially. So there is a huge level of privilege that I had as a young entrepreneur. And I'm not saying that every young business owner has that, but I'm just speaking from my personal story, because I was living at home and because my parents have a level of kind of economic stability. I always had that safety net. And so that meant for me that leaving school early, saying yes to the freelance job that only paid, a few hundred a month, taking risks in my business, taking time out when I was burnt out, waiting for the right opportunities, all of those things was so much easier to do because there wasn't much risk involved. It wasn't even that I was able to take bigger risks, but I just wasn't even really taking risks. Like, now that I have a mortgage and bills and other people in my life that I'm supporting, a risk is a much bigger deal because there's a lot more that I'm risking. Whereas back then, all I was probably risking was just maybe a little bit of like my money that I needed to survive. But it's amazing to me how long you can live, especially if someone else is paying for your food and your house, without actually needing a lot of money. I had a very simple lifestyle, as I'm sure many 16, 17-year-olds do. Because of that, I was really able to take bigger risks, run the business full time, even when it wasn't paying me enough for it to be full time. And I think ultimately just put in more consistency without needing to see those results back so quickly. I will also mention the privilege of having people there that could bail you out if you ever needed it. I've talked on this podcast before about when I got surprised by a tax bill very early on in my business. It was about £4,000, hadn't saved for it, learned a lot of lessons very quickly about finances, and my parents helped me out. They gave me a loan, I paid them back. I acknowledged that, if I didn't have parents that were in that situation, if I wasn't, a young person who probably had then more of a connection to their parents, I don't know what would have happened in that that scenario, that would have been a far bigger problem than it ended up being. Don't get me wrong, at the time it felt like the biggest problem in the world, but I can 100% see in hindsight how parts of my experience were made easier, more comfortable, less risky because of that privilege that I had. And that is something I will always talk about. I find it bizarre that people don't want to acknowledge like the privilege that helped them start their business, or the privilege that, whether you got a loan at the start, whether your partner was financially supporting it, like whatever it is, it just acknowledges the deck of cards that you were playing with, right? It's like everyone gets given a different set of cards. And I think being shady about that and people pretending that like, no, it's fully bootstrapped, I've never had any help, or, there's nothing else that's benefited me other than just my hard work. I know for some people that is the truth, and that is really, really impressive. But most business owners, right, in some way, an element of our own privilege, even if it's just based on the color of our skin or how we identify or where we live, right, all of those things make a difference. And so I would say I've had a lot of privilege, especially right at the start of that business journey, that really helped me to get started and take that action. And then to round us off, the final reflection I have from being a young entrepreneur, and the final thing I'll share that I feel hindered me in my journey as an early business owner, is that I had no clue how to do anything. When I say I have no clue how to do anything, like I maybe knew how to like send an email. I maybe knew how to like do a little bit of video editing because I was that kid at school that would make the videos for the, class homework, and I had a few skills in that. But like, can I just remind you, I had never been employed in a real like corporate role. I didn't even really know how to like set up a Zoom meeting, or it was Skype at the time that we were using back then. I didn't know how to create contracts. I didn't even know that you needed contracts. I didn't know that you had to save for tax. I didn't know how to create bank accounts. I didn't know how to make invoices. I didn't know as well a lot of the like unspoken things, right? I didn't really know like the etiquette of like working with other people in a kind of business setting. I didn't know how to network. I didn't know why events would be valid. Like I can keep going, but you can assume probably 95% of the things that it's like mildly helpful to know about, I didn't know because I was 17, because I'd never been in a proper job. People that have maybe a bit of corporate experience, 100% there'll still be so much about running a business that's new to you. But what they might have is at least a few years where maybe they've learned how to do admin, or maybe they've learned how to like just navigate relationships in a business setting. Like it's those tiny things that I think unless you don't know them, you don't realize how hard it is not to know them. And because of that, I would describe my first few years of business as just a baptism of learnings. Like I was just learning everything. And thankfully, I had that naivety and that optimism and that enthusiasm that I was like, oh, this is so fun. I'm loving learning. This is great. But looking back, I do see, quite slow growth for quite a long time in my business that I think if I'd have maybe known more from the off, could have been avoided. Little things like knowing that tax is a thing. I didn't know that. They don't teach you that in school. I was 17. No one told me about tax. Or knowing about how to set like terms of working with a client and boundaries, because I'd never learned about that. I just completely burned out, let my clients walk all over me, had no systems and processes. Didn't even know what systems and processes meant. Like the level of my lack of knowledge was so immense that I just felt like I had to learn every lesson the hard way. And don't get me wrong, I do think I am someone who has to learn the lessons the hard way. Like that works for me. I like to learn through doing. If you try and teach me something like verbally, I struggle. I do have to often like do the thing to learn the lesson. But I could have probably benefited from maybe just a few less lessons that I had to learn that way. I definitely see like my first 3 years of business at least was 90% lessons, 10% results. And I don't think that combination ever stops. I'm still learning a lot of lessons even 10 years in, but I did notice, so after a few years I was like, oh, okay, I kind of feel like I know what I'm doing a bit now. Oh, maybe if I'd have had a corporate job for a few years, or I'd have done an apprenticeship, or I'd have gone to university, I don't know because I don't know, but I would imagine I might have had a few more of those things in place and had to learn a little bit less the hard way. I have to stop myself from feeling envious. People that start their businesses, after being very established in other businesses or in startups or in corporate careers, because I just think like, oh, you know so much and that's great. But as this episode has demonstrated, there's pros and cons to everything. You know, I could have worked in industry for 10 years and then started my business. And then I would have not had this challenge of not having the knowledge. But the thing that I just talked about, right, of having the privilege of being young and naive and living at home and not having bills to pay, well, that wouldn't have been true. So everything I think really does balance itself out. And I don't think it's ever helpful to think about regrets, because I can't change anything. And if I did, it would change, you know, where I am today. But I hope you found this interesting to kind of maybe just get a bit of an insight into some of those experiences I had as a young entrepreneur. I'm really passionate about opening up entrepreneurship as a kind of option for young people. You know, nowadays I think the conversation is much more being had, but back when I quit school, like, it just wasn't an option. It was like, you either go to university or you do an apprenticeship. And apprenticeships actually is what I ended up doing. I did an apprenticeship alongside my business because otherwise it would have been illegal to quit school at 16. But there was such a judgment around how apprenticeships were talked about. I'm hoping that that's a bit different now in schools, but back then I just didn't feel like being a business owner or being entrepreneurial was an option. And so that's where talking a bit more about my experience is something that I really wanted to do, because it's the best thing I ever did, quitting school to run this business. And I'm so glad that past me had that stubbornness and that optimism and that naivety, because no one else is going to take those risks for you. No one else is going to make those decisions for you. But yeah, like I said, one of the best things I ever did. So maybe you know a young person in your life that might find this episode valuable to listen to or to watch, or maybe this has just helped you to compare your origin story to mine and perhaps reflect on your own what helped and what hindered. You know, we all started businesses in different places with a different set of cards in a different position. And I've definitely found it interesting for this episode to just reflect on that experience of myself, not to categorize it as good or bad, but just to acknowledge, yeah, what were the pros, what were the cons, maybe what do I notice upon reflection. So I really hope you've enjoyed this episode as well. I'm going to be back in your ears and on your screens if you're watching on YouTube next week. So make sure that you're subscribed wherever you're tuning in to stay in touch with that. And if you are not already subscribed to my YouTube, let me invite you to take that action. Not only because you can watch these episodes and see me talking with my hands and staring off into the distance and see my facial expressions as I'm talking about this stuff, but also because I'm going to be sharing more behind the scenes vlog. A couple of weeks ago, I published my first ever vlog, which was bringing you behind the scenes of my biggest event ever, which was Small Business back in December. And the week this episode's coming out, I'm also going to be sharing a behind the scenes vlog of my retreat. So if you are someone that is nosy, that likes to see the behind the scenes of other businesses, that wants to know what's going on behind the social media stuff that you see, you're going to want to come and join over on YouTube. So if you're watching on YouTube, please do click subscribe. If you're listening to this, head to the link in the show notes, come to YouTube, click subscribe. You'll make my day. I'd love to share more vlog content with you. And that is it for another episode. Have a good one, and I'll be back in your ears soon.